It's 1 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and begin. So I'll introduce you, Liz.
Okay.
So hi everyone, welcome to one of the latest webinars we're doing here at Montpelier. I'm Matt Reeves. I'm Director of Archaeology here at Montpelier, and really excited to have a good friend and colleague back, Liz McCabe. Liz started her career path at Montpelier back in 2015 when she was a field school student, and she did the archaeology field school at Montpelier, and then spent a year with us as an intern, and then became a crew member, and then finally became a crew chief. And that was before she went to graduate school. And now she is a doctoral candidate at the University of Maryland.
Still a student.
Oh, still a student. Okay, yeah, you haven't done your proposal yet. Okay, yeah, don't want to that's
Yeah.
so, or have someone
Exactly.
like, what is Liz telling people? So she is a doctoral student at the University of Maryland. You completed your master's and is working on her proposal now, and she is she's studying equestrian networks and landscapes at Montpelier for her dissertation. And she, in 2021, she's going to be a John H. Daniels Fellow at the National Sporting Library Museum in Middleburg, Virginia, where she's going to be researching the role and expertise of African Americans in the equestrian industry. And today, what Liz is going to be talking with us about is equestrian history at Montpelier through time, both of the Madisons, the Duponts, and African American involvement in that industry and long culture that spans many generations and owners at Montpelier. So, Liz, thank you so much for being here today. Can't wait to hear about your research and what you've been finding. So I'm going to turn it over to you, and whenever you want, you can share screen. And for folks that are if you have questions, I'll be looking at the Q&A in the chat, and if it's something I can wiggle in with Liz while she's giving her talk, I'll kind of give Liz a prompt to answer the question, or we'll save them for the end. So there you go. Thank you, Liz.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks for that introduction. Hi, everybody. Like Matt said, I'm Liz, and I'm going to be your virtual guide today through the equestrian landscapes of Montpelier. Ideally, we would be walking around Montpelier in person for this tour, but the webinar format really allows for us to open this up to more people, and I get to show you a lot more historic images than I would get to otherwise. So for just a mini introduction to me, I grew up around horses, and so I'm a certified horse girl, and I rode competitively for most of my life, so I have a background in horses. Let's see, why is this not? There we go. And as Matt said, I'm also a former Montpelier employee, where I worked as an archaeologist from 2015 to 2018. On a lot of our archaeological investigations, we found a number of horse-related objects that I, being the horse girl that I am, was instantly drawn to, and I was hooked on the idea of studying historical uses of horses. And this research idea kind of snowballed at Montpelier, and led me to where I am now, which is a PhD student at the University of Maryland, studying these equestrian landscapes at Montpelier. So what you're about to hear is my research thus far, and due to the time constraints of the webinar, I'm really only scratching the surface of what I am going to talk to you guys about. So please ask questions, because I could really talk on and on about this. So without further ado, I'm going to walk you through the different time periods and the use of the horses over time at Montpelier. I'm sure that a number of you have visited the Montpelier grounds, but for those of you that haven't, I'll give you just a quick introduction and a recommendation that you get out there soon for a visit. The property is known today as James Madison's Montpelier, located in Central Virginia, home to 4th President of the United States, James Madison, Jr. The original 5,000-acre plantation is a historic property with close to 300 years of recorded history. The landscape and structures on the property were modified under the directions of 3 generations of Madisons from 1723 to 1844, several temporary owners from 1844 to 1901, and 2 generations of the Dupont family until the property was bequeathed to the National Trust for Historic Preservation in 1984. Under each ownership, the plantation was a landscape of equestrian history in addition to human history. The presence of horses and horse-related labor has shaped the agriculture, transportation, and culture of its occupants, and is still a celebrated part of the landscape today. Though there's not a lot of information on the Native American occupants of the land that would later become Montpelier, we know that the area was occupied by the Monacan and the Manahoic tribes, who were eventually pushed from the area by the mid-18th century. There's a reasonable likelihood that horses would have been around at this time by way of various trade routes that made their way up and down the East Coast. However, we don't have any concrete evidence of horses on the landscape prior to the Madison occupation of the land. Which brings us to our first Madison on the landscape. The property, Ambrose Madison, that is. So the property known today as Montpelier was first acquired by James Madison Jr.'s grandfather, Ambrose Madison, in 1723. Ambrose initially sent overseers with a group of enslaved laborers, as well as a few horses to clear the land for use as a tobacco plantation. The landscape was heavily forested at the time upon arrival, and so horses were used as work animals to haul logs and plow fields. After 9 years of clearing the land, the Madison family moved to their newly established homestead known as Mount Pleasant in 1732. Here, this image is an artist's interpretation of what that may have looked like. Shortly after moving to Mount Pleasant, Ambrose dies from a complication of an alleged poisoning by two of his slaves and a slave from a neighboring plantation. His widow, Frances Madison, runs the plantation on her own until their eldest son, Colonel James Madison, later known as Madison Sr., as father of President Madison, and until he came of age. In the will and inventory of Ambrose Madison's estate, 10 horses as well as 3 trace harnesses and a pair of horse fleems were recorded on the property. The 10 horses listed in the inventory of Ambrose Madison were almost certainly used as agricultural tools at this time. Used to plow fields, haul logs, pull wagons full of crops, not dissimilar to the horses and men pictured here, although this picture is from the 20th century occupation of Montpelier. So rather than the draft horses you would see in this image, the horses owned by Ambrose were probably what were called Virginia horses or Chickasaw horses, which were common horses of no particular lineage, some Irish and Scottish breeds mixed with Spanish horses. So they were kind of these small, stocky horses used for general agricultural labor and sometimes riding. The trace harnesses that were listed in the inventory would have attached to a breast collar or the hames around a horse's neck to then and attached to the plow or the wagon that the horses were pulling to churn up soil and transport materials. As a newly established plantation, the success of the agricultural ventures would have placed horses in this primarily functional role, as opposed to one of a status display that we kind of see later on in the history of the plantation. The horse fleems pictured on the right that were listed in the inventory would have looked very similar to the ones pictured here from VCU, and they would have been these pointed knives that were used for bloodletting practices. So the knives would have been used to create a small wound in the horse's neck, typically around the jugular, and this would release what was thought of as bad blood that was infecting the animal. And other times this tool could have been used to release an abscess or a similar type of wound. And when you think about it, at the time, there weren't veterinarians who came to look after these horses on a regular basis. So most medical procedures, if they were done on property by who was there. And although Madison Ambrose could have performed this work, it's more likely that an overseer, or even more likely an enslaved individual, was the person who would have done this kind of procedure, because these are the people who are caring for these animals on a day-to-day basis. So Ambrose Madison's eldest son, James Madison Sr., President Madison's father, was raised at Mount Pleasant and with his siblings and his mother Frances, who was running the plantation on her own until he came of age. When Madison Sr. took over running the plantation, the tobacco industry that was begun by his parents wasn't faring as well on the Piedmont soils of Mount Pleasant. I mean, tobacco is just so extractive on the landscape. So Madison begins to diversify his business ventures of the plantation by, in addition to growing tobacco, growing wheat, corn, various orchard fruits such as peaches and apples. He established a brandy distillery and a mill on the property. So he really had his hands in many pots, you could say. And he also established a profitable blacksmithing shop on the estate located adjacent to where the temple stands today. It kind of would have been back further than the picture of the temple shows here. During archaeological investigations of this area, extremely high quantities of blacksmithing byproduct called slag, which is pictured on the top left, was recovered from this area. I mean, just sandbags and sandbags full of slag. This was in addition to various pieces of iron scrap metals, horseshoe nails, horseshoes, bridle fragments, hand-wrought nails, oxen shoes, just things that are really indicative of a thriving blacksmith shop. So Madison Sr. had connections to merchants in Liverpool who he would trade his crops for goods that Madison could then sell at this blacksmith shop. Travelers would stop through the Montpelier blacksmith shop to get their horses reshod and purchase supplies. You could almost think of it as kind of your local convenience store today, although definitely less convenient than ours are. But regular customers would range from small-scale farmers to the landed gentry, as well as merchants and tradesmen in the area. Most people were local who came by, but we do have records of customers coming from as far away as Philadelphia to the north and Kentucky to the west. So this blacksmith shop would have been overseen by an enslaved blacksmith, likely the enslaved blacksmith named Moses, who supervised 5 other blacksmiths operating 4 forges simultaneously on the property. And these images depict what a blacksmith and wheelwright shop looked like on the left, and on the right, some of these tools that were required to man the blacksmith shop. Madison Sr.'s business ventures were extremely profitable, and through the exploitation of the expertise of Moses and the other enslaved blacksmiths on the property, it really bolstered the Madison family's profits and therefore their rise to an elite planter family in the area. Where's my mouse? There we go. So due to the success of these agricultural ventures, Madison is increasing his involvements in local politics. The sales from the blacksmith shop, things like that, are allowing the Madisons to purchase more property and to have a 2-story, 5-bay Georgian brick house built and completed around 1765. Here, he and his wife Nellie and their children, including James Madison Jr., resided. And during this time, horses are slowly shifting from being primarily an agricultural tool to an object that symbolizes the status of their owner. This is occurring as the Madisons are leaving the plantation more frequently as these social elites. And when you think about it, on a plantation, the planter's reputation is really only as good as his house and his crops. But upon leaving the plantation, the rider of a horse or the passenger in a carriage is no longer associated with the plantation, but rather by the quality of their attire, their horses as their horse tack, their carriages, basically seeing the horse as an extension of themselves. And this is a kind of a judgment that came about at the time that really led to an increased interest in getting fancier tack, fancier carriages, finer riding attire. So as the Madisons are starting to take their children to schools and traveling into town for political events and socializing with fellow members of this landed gentry, their horses and riding carts and eventually carriages likely start to reflect this higher social status. So this brings us to James Madison Jr., future president of the United States. So he's born in 1751 and is likely taught to ride horses from a young age. However, we don't really have a ton of evidence of him interacting with horses until he leaves for school at the College of New Jersey, where he attended from 1769 to 1771. And it's during this time that we see Madison corresponding with his father via letters. And while James didn't keep a horse at school with him, he would write to his dad and ask him for money to procure a horse for him to take back to Montpelier, as seen in the quotes pictured here. And on these journeys to and from school, he almost always was accompanied by an enslaved horseman who would help transport Madison and his things. This horseman would then travel back alone with the horses on what I'm sure was a much different journey solo than it was when he was accompanying Madison. In 1772, following Madison's graduation from the College of New Jersey, he becomes involved in local political scene from 1774 to 1780. And during these early years of Madison's political career, it's clear his focus was on establishing himself in the world of politics, though he was in constant correspondence with his father about the state of the plantation. So in such correspondences, he was really particular with his dad about which horses he wanted his father to send him, that his father should have prepared to ride, versus which he thought should be used for plowing activities, or which mares he thought should be bred to which studs. So clearly James Madison wanted to be involved in the decision-making process about the plantation horses. And as time went on, the Madison family eventually kind of expands their horse industry, picking up additional horses as well as vehicles over the last few years of Madison Sr.'s life. So from the 1780s to 1801, Madison Sr. grew his horse population from 13 to 28 at his death. An overseer on the property, Thomas Melton, recalled that in Sr.'s last years, quote, "the horses on the plantation were numerous, but very indifferent except two," end quote. So of which two, it's not clear, but here we can see that the horses were still highly needed for the plantation operations. And then a handful of them, maybe just two, were reserved as these status symbols that I kind of mentioned earlier. On occasion, James Madison Jr. would travel by public stagecoach, which he did not seem to enjoy. These public stagecoaches would be comprised of a larger carriage that held several people headed to the same place, kind of like a bus route today. And these lines would run on set routes from cities such as Philadelphia or Richmond, and Madison would have to catch another public stage from Richmond to Orange, which is the closest town to Montpelier, approximately 5 miles away. And then from Orange, he would have to make sure his father had sent him a horse that he could then ride the 5 miles back to Montpelier. So clearly a bit of a hassle. And as an emerging politician, Madison openly expressed frustration at the idea of having to ride in a public stagecoach, enough so that he would consider postponing trips. In this example, he's writing to Thomas Jefferson in 1791, and he's just detailing the woes of having to take the stage. It's too inconvenient. It travels too rapidly. He wants to avoid it, but his horse is sick. And in the end of this instance, Madison wrote later and said his horse was healed, so he was able to make the journey without suffering through the stagecoach journey. But it's really eye-opening example of how tedious and long travel took and what James Madison thought of it. In the 1790s and early 1800s, Madison had become more established as a political figure, especially following his release of the Virginia Plan, paired with his father's gift of 560 acres of Montpelier, as well as his marriage to Dolly Madison in 1794, all of which allowed him to kind of turn more attention to his estate. So James and Dolly married while James was working in Philadelphia while representing Virginia in the House of Representatives. And following their marriage, James and Dolly resided in Philadelphia for 3 years before returning to Montpelier with Dolly's son, John Payne Todd, in 1797. Dolly was known for being quite a socialite and having bold tastes in colors and fashion. And she also had very particular tastes in her horses. She was known for requiring matching sets of horses with calm temperaments to pull her carriages, and she had quite a penchant for gray horses. A merchant and trader at the time, Robert Patton, was known to accommodate her requests as best he could. In 1808, Patton was searching for a pair of horses to serve as Dolly's carriage mounts, and he would send her these frequent updates, 2 of which are pictured here. You know, he's looking for an amiable partner, a pair of horses just to, he wants to find a suitable match. And so he's having trouble finding them, but he does find a pair of stout gray horses to try out. And those end up being good travelers, very gentle and well broke. So he does take them and buy them from Dolly and James. And Dolly was very happy with these horses. And Patton had to be really great about accommodating these needs of hers because Dolly was known for her fear of strange horses. She wanted really gentle horses. And of course she loved her grays. But these ended up being winners. Now, tragedy struck the gray horses because just 2 years after she got them, one of them had passed away, and Dolly would not be seen in public without an unmatched set of horses pulling her vehicle, even if this meant she could not attend horse races, which was a favorite pastime of Virginia elites, and especially so for socialite Dolly Madison. So when one of her gray's horses had died, she wrote, "The race is just over. I did not go. We had lost one of our fine large grays, and I could not go in good style." And in this instance, Patent was called on again to find another one to replace him. But he was unable, quote, to find a pair or even a single horse fit to match the others, end quote. So this didn't occur for a full year until he was able to find another match. But clearly so much was dependent on these matching horses, or rather how the Madisons looked at these events, that this impacted their socializing. Speaking of horse racing, the sport of horse racing really boomed in the early 19th century. And though horse racing had been around and practiced since the early 17th century, it really wasn't until the late 18th, early 19th century that the interest in horse racing as a sport really emerged. And this was due in large part to an influx of thoroughbred horses being imported from England, and this brought a lot of new interest to the sport, and Madison seems to have gotten involved in this wave. So elite planters were known to spectate and often place their own horses in the races. Winners were published in local newspapers, they won prize money, and the experience presented an excellent opportunity for socializing. Though such socializing at horse races would not be what I or many others would expect of shy, sickly, reserved James Madison, it's possible that he saw, or in all likelihood Dolly saw for him, an advantage and an opportunity to use the participation in the horse world for a political gain. Dolly, who was known for creating particular seating charts at Madison dinners to accomplish Madison's political goals, and for whose social abilities are said to be a large part of why Madison won his presidency in 1809, undoubtedly understood the connections that were being made at the racetrack. Prior to his presidency, Madison had begun to breed his own thoroughbreds, seeing the value in making selective choices and breeding his mares. This is in part due to his friendship with Dr. William Thornton, who was a physician and the architect of the US Capitol, and who had also established a horse breeding operation nearby. Madison begins to breed many of his mares to Thornton's studs or stallions, and these stallions had ancestry to really well-known thoroughbred stallions such as Fear Not, Driver, High Flyer, and High Flyer is listed here, his stud record, listed here from Thornton's records, showing that Madison had put a season of his mare to High Flyer in 1803. And Madison at the time claimed, "I have long regretted that in rearing horses, I have so long made use of inferior brood mares, particularly those not thoroughbred, to which fancy and fashion attach so much value, and shall in future endeavor to repair the error." So it's at this point that we now see, in addition to utility, transportation, and mere appearances, breed becomes this highly valued characteristic in horses among elite planners. And this is occurring as the thoroughbred industry is peaking in this time of increased racing, gambling, and sporting culture. During Madison's presidency from 1809 to 1817, despite he and Dolly's best efforts to present themselves with the highest quality horses and riding vehicles, as president, he was subject to criticism from the general public. On one occasion, while riding into Washington, D.C., an observer overheard a, quote, high-minded Maryland Democrat, end quote, criticizing his carriage to the point of bringing up the next election. The observer is recorded as saying, "What was my surprise to see only a couple of plain rusty carriages headed by a single outrider. For shame, I will make your coachman grease the harness and wash the dirt off your old nitty-naughty carriage, or by Jove, I'll not support you at the next election." And the person who overheard this even criticizes the horses and say they looked like this plain brown carriage. The horses looked lazy with long tails, no check reins. They looked more like the plow horses of some old Virginia farmer than the coach horses of the President of the United States. And this is such an interesting example. It's probably one of my favorites because these features in the horses are seen as reflections of the president himself. The long tails, the rusted carriage, black coats, lack of check reins. These are seen as representations of plow horses and not coach horses, and especially not coach horses for the president of the United States. Now, it ends up okay for Madison because it turns out the reason for their presence in their older carriage was for a good reason, and it was to accommodate the luggage and the chambermaids that they had put in their nicer carriage so that they could all fit. But soon enough, this nicer carriage came by and all was well. But it's still such an interesting example of how the depiction of one's horse and carriage was used in a way that had potentially devastating social and political impacts. So let's see. So throughout these, increasingly large changes in Madison's life, with his rise as a political figure, his father's death in 1801, his inheritance of Montpelier, and his marriage to Dolly Madison, he's steadily growing his horse operations at Montpelier. So prior to 1787, he is not listed as owning any horses, probably because they were listed under his father. And though he had kind of referred to some of horses previously as his, they weren't actually taxed as his. And so in 1787, he has 4 horses that are taxed to him. And it seems to me that as you kind of go down this chart, he's increasing his herd of horses as he's gaining political prominence. And so you see, he goes from 9 horses to 14 horses, 21 horses, and a stallion. And then in 1809, the year Madison becomes president of the United States, he owns 43 horses, the highest number he'll ever own. And though he possesses anywhere from 20 to 38 until the last 3 years of his life, dying with 13 horses to his name, it's a pretty significant decline after the presidency. And so for me, this begs the question, what causes James Madison's sudden increase in interest in horses? Was it merely because Madison was established as a political figure and needed horses to travel and plow fields and aid in the plantation operations? No doubt horses served many purposes on the plantation, and naturally some of them were used for agricultural processes because Madison had a thriving wheat industry, among other things. However, Madison was really known to favor oxen instead of horses for agricultural work. He had a speech in the Agricultural Society of Albemarle in 1818 that I cannot consider it an error in our husbandry that oxen are too little used in the place of horses. And he goes on further to claim that oxen made much better work animals at less expense than horses. And so these sentiments are pretty strong, and they've been reflected in the archaeological record. We used to find oxen shoes, which are really only a half a horseshoe because oxen have cloven hooves. And so we used to find those on site, which suggested that he was using oxen agriculturally at Montpelier. And so from this, it suggests that Madison's agricultural operations are not the key driving factor to why he is increasing his population in horses. It's possible that the influx of breeding and importing horses was for the emerging horse racing scene in Virginia. Though so far there's only one positive record linking Madison to horse racing as an owner, which was an account from an enslaved man who was owned by James Madison, known as Paul Jennings, who claimed that, quote, no jockey ever cheated him. But several of Madison's horses have been additionally located in these thoroughbred pedigree records, which I've posted one here. And it's difficult to prove that some of these horses were raced, despite their bloodlines indicating that they had favorable pedigrees for the sport. For example, this horse, Wild Medley, he has several, he's a descendant of Fear Not, who was probably one of the biggest stallions at the time. And so we're not exactly sure how involved Madison was as a breeder and owner in the industry. From the accounts of Dolly Madison, he did attend these races frequently, and it's clear that their appearances at these races was of the utmost importance at such events. So we bring back this chart again because it's possible that the answer behind this increase in horse population might be due to Madison's prominence as a political figure, throwing him into the social circle with other wealthy elites. Dolly Madison's role as a socialite and her desire to interact with fellow elites, socialize, be entertained, it could have drawn Madison further into this elite planter class. And he likely realized the significance of these social interactions and how politically beneficial it would have been to be known among these elites, and he could have used the races as an avenue for political gain. In part, this shift could be to keep appearances, especially given his prominence in politics. Madison had to match the part of the elite or suffer the consequences, as evidenced from the types of criticism that his carriage received on merely one recorded outing by the public. So it's not directly clear if the role of the horse contributed to the acquisition of political power for 19th century planters, but it's interesting that Madison's horse population declines following his retirement from office. So this brings us to the role of the overseer at Montpelier, a role that's really fraught with complexities as men in a middle space between the landed gentry and a laborer. Montpelier had both white and free, as well as black and enslaved overseers on the plantation. From their interactions with Madison and the horses on the property, overseers appear to have played a role in the decision-making process regarding Madison's horses. They've been recorded as receiving direct instruction from Madison regarding horses as well as enslaved people on the property. And they would offer Madison advice on which horses should be bred to which mares, what the value of certain horses should be if he was going to sell, and whether or not Madison should buy certain horses, and so on. And while employed at Montpelier, Overseer Mordecai Collins was instructed to avoid riding certain horses unless Madison Sr. told him otherwise. He was also instructed to alert enslaved overseer Sawney to begin breaking in or taming horses at an adjacent property and to use certain horses for agricultural work. And so, though more research needs to be conducted on the role of the overseer, that is currently ongoing at Montpelier in the archaeology department, as pictured here at the overseer's site. And it seems plausible that given the emergence of the thoroughbred breeding and racing in the 19th century, white lower class men, who were often the overseers on the property, they may have sought out positions in the horse racing industry to raise their social status at the time. So the sport of horse racing was said to have been an equalizing space for white men of varying social classes, as well as a space with significant potential for upward mobility. The horse racing environment was even somewhat of an accepting environment for people of color, though this was not without drawbacks. The surge of enslaved grooms and jockeys in the late 18th, early 19th century horse industry gave enslaved horsemen greater autonomy and in some cases prestige. Yet it was also said to have diminished the status associated with the horse industry, which then was hurting lower class white grooms in the process. So this, despite what was likely a source of contention between overseers and enslaved horsemen, lower class men had the privilege and the potential to secure themselves in a higher social class through participation in the thoroughbred racing industry, which was not the case for those who were enslaved. So all of this was potentially influencing the behaviors of Montpelier's overseers, who were very active in contacting Madison about potential horses to purchase, quality of stallions, and interactions between horse breeders. Let's see. So labor within the United States horse industry has been reliant on the expertise of marginalized people since the 17th century. Enslaved people were the caretakers, trainers, breeders, blacksmiths, veterinarians, and jockeys of these animals. They were absolutely essential to the transportation of the animals to races, produced the food horses ate, constructed the stables where horses lived, were the blacksmiths that forged their shoes, and administered medical care when they fell ill. And yet enslavers listed the value of horses alongside the value of enslaved men and women in probate records. At Montpelier, archaeologists have uncovered artifacts that help to better understand the lives of enslaved people who worked in the fields alongside the horses that were used to plow fields and haul crops during harvest time, as well as those who worked in the Madison stable and lived at the stable quarter nearby. The only positively known location for one of Madison's stables is located near the present-day visitor center. It's believed to have been a dressing stable used for grooming and tacking of horses for riding. And this stable was likely built around 1790 because we see from Madison instructions to his overseers to, quote, have the stable made of the best white oak logs and the tobacco pens as soon as possible. And another instructing them to, quote, have chestnut logs for the principal stable cut and hauled. Both of these acts would have been work that the enslaved community was tasked with completing. And then we have this map from 1837. It was a fire insurance policy taken out by Dolly shortly after James's death in 1836, which depicts several outbuildings in the south yard. But then there's also a line that I've highlighted that says line leading to stable 451 feet. And so we looked in that area archaeologically and via metal detector survey and with soil chemistry analysis to look for artifacts, foundations, or changes in the soil from horse waste. And all of these methods combined were able to tentatively identify where we believe the stable was located. And although no foundations were located, it indicates that the stable was likely entirely a wood structure. Here's a rendering that was done after the Montpelier Diggers TV show was run to look for the stable. And so the stable was fairly close to the house. However, it's likely that James Madison rarely visited this space. More than likely, this area was managed by the expertise of enslaved horsemen who did all the care, cleaning, and maintenance of these animals. So then when we just head down the hill a little bit, we down from the dressing stable is the stable quarter, which is today a reconstruction of a slave quarter that would have been lived in by enslaved horsemen who worked in the stable complex, which was kind of that whole area. It's possible that enslaved gardeners or other enslaved craftsmen may have also lived here based on archaeological evidence. And the reconstruction that you see in the bottom right sits directly on top of the archaeological footprint of the building that you can see top right. These excavations were done in 2010, and they found artifacts that range from daily eating, cooking, and living space materials, as well as high quantities of horse-related materials such as horse bits, saddle trees, buckles, horseshoes, etc. So in the retirement years of James Madison, he maintains a number of horses for his personal use. However, he cuts back on actively breeding horses as he had been leading up to his presidency. Oops, I don't know why that happened. When visitors came to pay them a visit, James often took guests on rides around the plantation. In the last 2 years of his life, he enjoyed to, quote, take exercise in his carriage in the open air, end quote, which, according to Dolly, aided in his health somewhat. In bouts of illness, Dolly writes of their mutual optimism to have him driven in the carriage once the weather and his health allowed. So over the course of his life, Madison didn't necessarily express key favorite horses that he had. However, his niece, Mary Cutts, talks of a horse Madison had, which, quote, had grown old in his service and was petted, fed, and stalled alone. And this horse was named Liberty, very fitting. She explained that the horse was often erroneously blamed for any outrage which cattle could commit, and said James would fondly retell these stories about Liberty. So that's kind of our best guess as to some of his favorite horses, although he had so many over the course of his lifetime. So following the death of James Madison at the age of 85 in 1836, Dolly attempts to keep the plantation afloat, but ultimately sells the plantation following economic hardship. So the plantation sold in 1844, and the plantation rapidly cycles through 7 different owners over the course of 57 years until the Dupont family purchases the property in 1901. And these various owners made several changes to the house. They added stucco, they removed outbuildings, lengthened the columns on the front portico, but they really didn't make a lot of drastic agricultural or landscape changes, which has allowed for really well-preserved archaeology sites that have been mostly untouched since the Madison occupation on the landscape, with a few exceptions. So this brings us to the Dupont family. And the Dupont family originates with the patriarch pictured on the left, Pierre Samuel Dupont de Nemours, who immigrated to the US from France in 1799 to escape consequences of the French Revolution. And his son, E.I. Dupont, formed the gunpowder plant and mill along the Brandywine Creek in Delaware, pictured on the right. And this company was wildly successful, and the Dupont family rapidly rose to prominence and wealth in the United States. So E.I.'s grandson, William Dupont Sr., pictured here, purchased Montpelier in 1901 after looking for a suitable country home for his children. William and his second wife, Annie Rogers Dupont, who he quickly married after divorcing his cousin, him and Annie had 2 children, Marion and Willy. The children were living in Berkshire, England at the time, and doctors told their parents that they needed to be raised in a place with higher elevation for their health. And though the Dupont family headquarters is located in Delaware, the climate was said to be too damp for the children. So William was looking around for properties in Virginia, and he wrote to them telling his children that he had a man driving him around Virginia looking for a home for them. And while he was driving through, his driver at the time told him that they could take a back road through the back of Montpelier to get to their next destination. And that's how William kind of stumbled upon Montpelier and was instantly interested in the estate. He sought out the properties to raise Hackney and Percheron horses, and he also hoped it would help him regain public favor upon his return from England and to escape from family conflicts surrounding his family business in Delaware, and to kind of cover up from his divorce and remarriage. So all in all, it was a kind of a really good plan for William Dupont Sr. to own Montpelier. So they moved to the estate in 1902, and over the next 3 years began to make drastic changes to the main house. He adds 32 rooms to the existing 22-room structure. It really increases the square feet of the house to over, it's astronomical. They really lengthened the back of the house. They added back wings to the lawn. So he also added a pink stucco to the exterior of the house. And over the next decade, he constructs numerous new buildings on the property, including both buildings in the top left photo, which is a carriage house in the foreground and a power plant in the back. And William Dupont also had a number of barns built, of course. And to point out just a few of my favorites, the top left was a quarantine barn, we believe. And we don't know a ton about it, but it had room for a large stall and a place for someone to stay. Why does that happen? Don't want it to. Okay, to someone to stay, clean up, and it's currently used for storage. On the top right is our stud barn, where the stallions would have been kept on the property, and it's also currently used for storage. Bottom left is the pony barn, which was built for the ponies of the Dupont children, and the pony barn today now houses the museum program's offices. And on the right, probably one of my favorite barns is the Broodmare Barn, and these would have been really big, roomy stalls for expecting mares. And it's a really gorgeous building that now houses the horticulture department at Montpelier. And then just for one of my final favorites in the spirit of Halloween, this is the schooling barn that was built by William Dupont. And as the name suggests, it was used for the exercising the horses and riding. And it also was so stunning that it dabbled in Hollywood because it was also used as the set of the 2001 horror film Hannibal. And now I am not a horror fan myself, so I would never watch this movie, but I did my due diligence and I have discovered that it took place, this scene in the schooling barn was during the pig scene, if anyone's familiar. I'll leave it at that. But the images here are still from the movie on the left, showing the ceiling of the schooling barn. And then on the right is a picture I took in 2019. And so it's just a really gorgeous, gorgeous building, and it's used for architectural storage today. Okay, so back to the Dupont people. So William's children, Marion and Willy, spent most of their childhood at Montpelier, with occasional summers spent back in England. They were educated on the property and were allowed to explore and roam the grounds as they pleased. Marion reflected later in life that she used to aid in farming tasks like shearing sheep and helping in the dairy as a child. The children wanted ponies so badly when they got to Montpelier, but Annie Dupont, their mother, initially resisted because she was worried Marion would get bowed legs from riding horses. But soon enough, the children wore them down, and at 8 and 6, when they were 8 and 6, they were able to receive ponies that arrived at the train station in outside the property. So the ponies had names such as Barbara, Bonnie Belle, Midget, and Marion's favorite white Welsh pony, pictured here, Grisette. And the ponies were likely stabled at that pony barn that we just saw. There's a space kind of between the gardens and the pony barn that Marion and Willy created a space they referred to as Coney Island, which was a space given to them to construct, play, and ride their ponies. Marion reflected that she and her brother were given nails, a saw, a hammer, and leftover boards to do with as they pleased. And in turn, they built a mini horse show ring, and they would host competitions with neighboring children, and they would have their parents or farm employees serve as the judges for these mock competitions. But as they grew older, they began hosting larger horse shows on the property and eventually competed at the Orange County horse shows and then eventually show circuits throughout the East Coast. So this is pictures of Willy Dupont, and stemming from their childhood at Montpelier, both Marion and Willy became well known in fox hunting, show jumping, and horse shows and thoroughbred industries in their adult years. Willy eventually went on to design and construct several horse racing properties throughout the country, including Fair Hill in Maryland, which is still running, as well as others in Delaware and Pennsylvania. And Marion attributes his success in this horse racing industry. She attributes this to their childhood spent constructing projects in Coney Island. Now for Marion, later Marion Dupont Scott, after a brief marriage with American actor Randolph Scott, she became an accomplished horsewoman. After growing up in side saddle, hunters, jumpers, and driving her hackney horses, she became the first woman to ride astride, aka legs on either side of the horse, as opposed to side saddle, in the Madison Square Garden Horse Show in 1915, which was quite unconventional for women at the time. Regarding that, she claimed, but in the show ring, if you wanted to put on a real good show against the men, the top riders from Kentucky, you had a much better chance riding like they did astride. As Marion grew older, she kind of tired of the show ring, preferring instead to fox hunt, and later decided to see if a particularly quick mare she owned had any potential at a local race in Orange. The mare was named Safety Catch and ended up winning the half-mile dash, and Marion was instantly hooked on horse racing. At the same time, her brother Willy began to acquire racehorses in Delaware and Pennsylvania. When Marion took over the operations at Montpelier, she had 2 racetracks constructed on the property, one a flat track, which you can see pictured in the foreground, and then the other was a steeplechase course with natural brush fences around when you can kind of see that around the line of cars. Let's see. Sorry about that. In 1934, Marion and her brother Willy formed the annual Montpelier hunt races that took place on flat and steeplechase race courses on the property, which is a tradition that continues to this day. And this is a great image because it really shows a great overhead of not only the Montpelier hunt races, this is from several years ago, but it also gives a great shot of some of the barns on the property. So I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but on the bottom right, there are these lower and upper race barns that were put in when Marion constructed the racetracks. And then back here behind the main house is where the pony barn and a number of other barns, the yearling barn, the quarantine barn, would have been located, as well as a warming hut that was used when they were fox hunting across the property. And then back here, you can see the schooling barn that I showed you guys earlier, back along the back road there. And then there had been several barns here that have been since torn down. And then there are several Sears and Roebuck barns back here. And these literally would have been ordered from a catalog and sent down piece by piece and constructed on the property. And those are great barns. So Marion begins to actively raise, train, and race thoroughbreds between her estates in South Carolina and Virginia and Delaware, but she moved much of her operation to Montpelier when the racetracks were constructed. So at this time, late 1920s, early 1930s, Marion had several prominent and successful winners. So she begins winning with a horse named Troublemaker, pictured here, and who she had a lot of success with in steeplechase racing. And then in 1931, Marion purchases, Marion purchases 2 of the horses she becomes more famous for owning, Annapolis, pictured here, as well as Battleship. And here's Battleship. And these were both sons of Man o' War, the famous racehorse. And so Battleship becomes Marion's most famous horse, I would say. He was bred in Kentucky and was only 15.1 hands, so he was pretty small for a racehorse. He ran flat races until he was 4. He kind of battled some injuries on and off. And then Marion bought him for $12,000 and begins training him for steeplechase racing. He ends up winning the American Grand National steeplechase race in 1934, ridden by jockey Carol Bassett. And then in 1936, she ships him to overseas and to prepare him for the British Grand National race, which he ran in 1938. Critics said he was too small, he would never make it through the course, and yet, ridden by a 17-year-old jockey, Bruce Hobbs, he wins the British Grand National, and that's him in the jumping picture in the lead. To this day, Battleship is still the only American-bred horse that has won both the British and the American Grand National steeplechase races, both of them. When he returns to the US after being overseas, a crowd meets him at the docks, which in the crowd was New York Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, as well as Randolph Scott, a number of other people celebrating Battleship's return. So he retires to stud back at Montpelier, and he produces several steeplechase winners and ends up dying at the age of 31, which is a ripe old age for a horse. And he, along with Annapolis and Marion's foundation mare, Accra, are all buried at Montpelier, just on a ridge near the temple. And if anybody wants more information on Battleship, there's a great book by DorothyOwers out about him, and I highly recommend it. here's Accra, one of Annapolis's foals that became Marion's foundation mare. And although Accra herself wasn't such a successful racehorse, she ended up producing numerous really successful offspring, such as Mongo, who accrued over $800,000 in winnings for Marion, as well as Niji, who also won a lot of championship races. So though Marion was so successful and was the owner of Montpelier, played such a large role in the training and management of these thoroughbreds, the labor of working with the horses was conducted by the grooms who lived and worked there. And a black jockey named Charles Smoot was riding for Marion Dupont in the 1930s, and he's pictured here in all three images. And he was supposed to ride in a race in North Carolina for Marion, and the officials tried to prevent him from riding due to his race. Marion told the officials that if Smoot didn't ride her horses, that she would not have her horses run. And Marion, being who she was, her prominence in the thoroughbred industry, the officials conceded and Smoot was allowed to race. And though the incident ended somewhat positively, it illuminates the challenges that Black horsemen have faced in the thoroughbred community throughout the 20th century. And this is discrimination that has really pushed most Black jockeys from the industry altogether. And so what this incident also shows is, Marion had been breaking rules and rewriting them for most of her life. And this was a trend that did not stop as she grew older. She spent the rest of her life at Montpelier, and though married and divorced twice, she did not produce any heirs. In her last will and testament, she bequeathed the property and $10 million to the National Trust for Historic Preservation, wishing for the property to transition from private residence into a historic site to commemorate James Madison's life. She also expressed her desire for the hunt races to continue each November, a tradition that continues to this day when there's not a pandemic. The events of the modern race are pretty similar to what Marion would have experienced: Jack Russell races, both flat and steeplechase courses. Although today we have pretty eccentric hat competitions as pictured here. So that might be a little different. Today, though the Duponts are no longer visible in the main home, you can still visit Marion's famous Red Room, as well as the Dupont Grand Salon, both rooms which were moved to the Visitor Center during the restoration of the house. The racetracks and several of the barns on the property remain in use for horses by private leasers, and many of the buildings on the property that supported the Dupont horse industry have been repurposed for administrative use, but can still be used. And I know we didn't get to talk about a ton of them today, so I'm including the QR code for a story map I've made that depicts some more of the buildings on the property that I might not have gotten to talk to today. So if you're interested, feel free to open your camera app and point your camera to the QR code, and a link should pop up, and you should be able to explore more of the grounds today that I just didn't have time to go into in as much detail. So you can view it from your home, or the next time you're at Montpelier, feel free to take the tour using the story map here. So to wrap up, through the entire history of the property, horses played this significant role in the social, political, and economic success of those who claimed ownership of this land. From the early days of clearing the land to establish the plantation, to the horses who were bred so that James, Dolly, Marion, and Willy had sporting events to gamble on and places to socialize. Montpelier is this quintessential equestrian landscape, and one that's molded itself to meet the demands and societal pressures of several generations of horsemen and women who took over the reins, and one that continues to shape the lives of all who traverse the landscape today. Thank you all so much for joining me on my tour today. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have enjoyed researching this topic. And again, this work is a lot of my dissertation research, so it's still very much ongoing, and I'm still constantly learning new things. So I would love to hear from you regarding questions, comments, cool finds, or any leads you have, because I want to find out as much as I can about this incredible place and the people who worked with the animals. So my contact information is there, and at this time, I'll turn it to Matt and see if we have any questions.
Yeah, Liz, that was an amazing presentation. Thank you so much. David has a question. David Mond, he says, how strong were Madison's equestrian skills? During the late 18th and early 19th century, was there prestige associated with equestrian skills, or was the focus solely on the horses, carriage, and tack?
That's a great question. For Madison himself, we don't have as much information about how he was as a horseman, but we do know that he used to ride across the plantation on a regular basis to survey the land and things like that. But the real information that we have is based on kind of more of the traveling, more of the horses and carriages and that kind of status. But at the time, it was definitely horse skills were definitely prized and valued and would have been a big status symbol. But we just don't know as much about Madison the horseman as we would like. But if I could find out more about it, I would love to. Any other questions?
Well, Liz, I'll see to anyone else that has questions, but I've got a whole raft of questions. The one I've got is the horse tracks. I'm just fascinated with, and is there any information on are there any horse tracks that Madison visited that were quite popular for racing in the local area within, say, a day's ride? And would you expect to have evidence of, if he was raising racehorses, evidence for a practice track at Montpelier?
That's a great question. I have not found any information as to whether or not they were practicing on the grounds, although, there's so many other properties. Black Meadow was also one of the properties that is listed as having horses there. So it's entirely possible that at some property owned by the Madisons that there may have been a practice track, but I haven't found any evidence of that. As far as tracks he may have visited, I know there were a number of tracks in Washington, D.C., being the political center, but a lot of these tracks have unfortunately, been built over and aren't there anymore, as far as I can tell. I know there was a track in Bowling Green that was listed at one point, but I don't know as much about it as I would like to. But no, there definitely would have been, I think in the DC area would have been their main racetrack center.
Yeah, I can't remember if Buckland's had a track down in Warrington. So yeah. Well, there's a couple of questions that's popped up since. Becky asks, any further information on Charleston, the black jockey who was or was not allowed to ride in 1931?
So Charles Smoot.
Oh yeah, Charles Smoot. Yeah, Charles.
Yeah, Smoot. Yeah. So we know a little bit, and I know that there was an event that Montpelier hosted recently where there was some people who were either descendant of Charles Smoot or knew him, or I actually met the pallbearer that was at Charles Smoot's funeral. And so it's still kind of an ongoing process to find out as much as we can about him. I'm trying to think of anything else I know off the top of my head. I mean, I know he rode for Marion for a number of years. But it's still an individual I'm really trying to learn as much as I can about as possible. So if anybody knows anything, please email me. I would love to know more.
And there's a poster session that I can put in. We'll be sending out the recording to everyone, and I can put that poster in there that Zan and the OCHS did. So
that would be great.
Chris Smith asked, could you tell us again the name of the author who wrote about Battleship?
Dorothy Ours, and I believe it's just Ours, O-U-R-S, I believe. I could be wrong on that, but the name is just Battleship, and you should be able to find it. But it's a great book. I highly recommend it.
And then Leslie Bouderer asks, were the Dupont barns also used as residences by the workers?
So I'm not sure if the barns were lived in by the workers. I mean, the quarantine barn has a place where someone could stay. I'm assuming it's if that was like for a sick horse, somebody was monitoring. But I'm not sure if there were a number of tenant houses built on the property. And so probably the workers would have lived in the tenant houses as opposed to the barns. But I'm not as positive on that as I would like to be.
And Chris Pass has a question. He says, I'm really interested to learn more about the role of enslaved and equestrian culture. I wish I knew more about the name of Madison's horse Liberty. As discussed also in my thesis, I was curious about the sort of hypocrisy experienced in power dynamics of enslaved individuals caring for a horse named Liberty, who is housed separately and perhaps of higher status than the enslaved themselves. Thoughts on this?
Definitely. I mean, it's such an interesting and awful kind of thing to think about, that, the people who are essentially creating the animals that they use for everything from transportation to agricultural work and for entertainment, and yet the people who make that possible are listed in the same line as the horses in terms of how much they're worth. And sometimes horses were valued more than the people. I mean, it's really kind of an awful thing to sit with. And it's so true. The fact that an enslaved individual would have been the ones taking care of the horse named Liberty, kind of insulting, honestly. So yeah, I mean, there's so much there, and there's so much complexity that I'm currently grappling with. And so this next year, I'm going to be going up to the National Sporting Library as a fellow, and I'm dedicating basically my entire time there to looking for information about African Americans, both enslaved and free, in the horse industry, so I can try and kind of piece together what that would have been like at Montpelier, using as much as I can. But no, it's so true. I mean, it's one of the things I'm most interested in, and yet that we have the least information about. So it's an ongoing process, and I'm hoping to shed more light on it as I continue with my dissertation.
John Hakes, were women of the Madison area known to ever ride horses solo, or is that not socially acceptable?
That's a great question. I mean, in that era, so we know that Thomas Jefferson's daughters and his wife prior to her passing, they rode side saddle sometimes, and would join them in the carriages and things like that on Thomas Jefferson's more wild rides. But he liked to ride really fast. And there was lots of accounts of that. So we know that women at the time were riding, but it was less common. And we don't know about Dolly. There was a source that we found that there was a saddle of Dolly Madison's that had been in a barn fire somewhere, but I don't think we ever proved that it was actually Dolly Madison's saddle, because that was the only time I had ever seen anything regarding Dolly riding a horse. So I'm not too sure about Dolly herself, but we do know that women at the time, if they rode, were riding side saddle.
And yeah, there's a number of people that have just given comments saying thank you, Liz, for a wonderful talk. Vicki Willard says, thank you for this. It brings back memories of the races I attended there with my family. And Julie has a question. Thank you for an interesting presentation. Do routes of travel matter when it came to horses as part of showing off?
Oh, that's a really good question. I'm sure it did. I mean, if you were, the routes itself were pretty treacherous. I mean, there were so many instances where bad roads would cause the wheels to break off of carriages, people to get thrown out of carriages, things like that. So the roads themselves were treacherous in and of themselves. So if you were looking really nice and you had your nice carriage, your nice horse, you would want to be showing that off. I mean, that's something really to show. So I mean, about people traveling down Washington, D.C., I'm sure that the routes people took, especially in the presidential carriage and things like that, I'm sure that was of importance. But that's such a great question and something I haven't really grappled with. So thank you. I'm definitely going to look more into that.
When the Marquis de Lafayette travels through Virginia and from D.C. and then from New York, people know his route. So that is Julia, it's a really interesting. I'm sure Liz is going to follow up on that.
I'm really writing down my notes. Yeah, great.
That's the best part of these presentations. Aside from your wonderful presentation, Liz, is some of the questions that come from it.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. Like I said, I mean, I feel like I'm just getting started, and there's so much more I want to learn. So if there's anything I didn't get to, or you want to learn more about, please shoot me an email or send me a tweet, or however. I mean, I would love to keep in contact with people who are interested in this research.
What I'll do, Liz, is I'll get everybody's email, both who was on the Zoom call but who registered, and I'll BCC everybody. But if it's okay, I'll put your email in the to line, and so everybody will have your email. But a number of people are saying hello and thank you. Like Peggy and Leslie are saying thanks so much, great presentation.
Thank you.
Let me comb through and see if I missed any questions. Liberty, Barney says, woot woot, great job, Liz. So I think, let's see. Yeah, everyone just saying excellent, love it. So yeah, I think that's all we've got. Well, Liz, thank you so much for doing this for us today. This has been a wonderful presentation. I mean, it would have been amazing to do a walking tour with you out in the landscape, but this, allows us to cover a lot of ground. Definitely.
Yeah, for sure. And maybe in the future I'll be able to give it in person sometime, so I can really show you all these really cool buildings we have. But take the story map tour, and that'll get you started until we can meet next time.
Yeah, and I'll make sure I'll get the story map link from you. So I'll put that into the email as well.
Great.
So all right, well, I think I don't see any more questions. So, well, thanks again, Liz. And
Thank you all so much. It was so great.
We'll be in touch.
Definitely.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.